I mean, most of the time it's the jail lost power on such and such a floor.
I'm sitting there.
There is no
Yeah.
So red is off. If you want the microphone and Tony to be off so you can cough or anything, red is off, green is on. You have control.
There's no green.
Not like
Oh, that's one of the other bases.
oh, sorry. Wait, that's on. And
So same thing for those two bases,
overdue.
And she hasn't, she's seen the message.
So I'm gonna leave this here. If my phone is connected. James is gonna get a charger. I have one person.
Oh, you were there.
I have a wireless mic just sitting there. Is that fine? You'll call for it. I can turn it off. Does someone want to be a custodian or anything? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, when we do the round of introductions, yeah, we'll take it off. Okay. Yeah, we can have it here. Oh, I guess you don't want it. Do you need it to be? No, because we can turn it off.
Red button, it's off. So you just turn it on, and I'll see you obviously. So you can turn on everything on this end. So no one's looking for it.
Yep. Okay. You got it. Oh, and there's just back there. So yeah, we'll give you a minute.
Does it charge even if your laptop's not working?
No, it's also there.
Oh, yes.
So anytime someone comes in, just mute. It's just. I can just hit mute.
Yeah, but then we don't want to be muted. Because they can hear.
Oh, so don't. You should just mute me for sure.
Yeah.
Like that. Hit the mute.
So need to move this.
Yeah, do you want to go on to the round of introductions? Or I can check. Just hit the button. Okay. Should we get going? Okay. Oh, this is a big table. Oh, Robin, we did try to set you all in one row, and then you were like, no. Robin wouldn't like this, I know. And then, okay. All right. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the third PCEF Committee Meeting, Portland Clean Energy Fund Committee Meeting, and the first meeting of the entire body of 9 members. My name is Sam Ross. Yes. I think that's right. My name is Sam Ross. I'm the program manager for the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And before I introduce some of the new members around the table, I wanted to just start with a reminder for the audience about what the Portland Clean Energy Fund is. The Portland Clean Energy Fund was created by local ballot measure 26201, which was passed by Portland voters in November 2018. The ballot initiative was led by communities of color in a coalition with labor, environmental groups, progressive business, and countless others. The initiative, now a city program, is the first of its kind nationally and globally, designed to invest 54 to 71 million annually in clean energy, climate action, and green careers for all Portlanders, but especially those who have not historically seen the benefits from green investments. The fund will ensure that Portland's climate action plan is truly implemented in a manner that supports social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. And with that, I wanted to just speak a little bit and welcome some of the newest members on the committee, starting with Faith Graham, who's the director of the Network for Energy, Water, and Health and Affordable Buildings, working at the intersection of affordable housing and energy efficiency. Faith, you bring a phenomenal expertise in legal and finance experience amongst a range of other things that we will have yet to see. Welcome. Jeffrey Moreland Jr., over here, works for his family-owned contracting outfit, working on a range of public construction projects focused in the road right-of-way. Jeffrey has a strong understanding of what it means to be a minority contractor navigating complex systems. We got Ramfis Villatoro over there, who is the Oregon State Coordinator for the Blue-Green Alliance, where he works with labor and environmental organizations to advance climate solutions and create quality jobs. Ramfis brings a deep background in organizing in the Latino community, grant making, fundraising, and advocating for workers. And lastly, and last but not least, is Andrea Hamburg. Andrea is the supervisor for the Healthy Homes and Communities team at Multnomah County Health Department. And Andrea brings a deep background in environmental health, environmental justice, nonprofit management, and grant administration amongst many of her other strengths. So needless to say, this is an incredibly talented committee amongst the existing committee members, and we're excited to kick off this meeting with a full committee. Before I just turn this over to my colleague Katie Lister, I just wanted to give you all a little brief update around an ask you placed to the committee, an ask you placed to PCEF staff in the last committee meeting. You asked staff to think about ways to bring in Native perspectives to the committee, and I just wanted to acknowledge that I have an email out to Laura John, the city's tribal relations director, to meet in the coming weeks, and we plan to respond to you all likely in your second meeting in December around how we might bring in that feedback amongst other feedback to the committee. So it's just Laura's been incredibly busy hosting the tribal summit, which took place late last week. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to my teammate Katie Lister to facilitate the rest of the meeting.
All right, well, I think we just want to start with a round of introductions, and if I could have the committee members introduce yourselves first, and then we'll ask everyone in the audience, and I'll just walk the microphone around and ask that you just give your name, your pronouns, and an affiliation if you have one. Maria?
Sure, good evening, everyone. Maria Sippen, she, they. Good evening, Faith Graham, she, her. Andrea Hamburg, she, her.
Ramfis, JGW 401.
Shanice Brittany Clark, she, her, they.
Robin Wang, he, him.
Javon Jr., he, and him.
Megan Horst, she, her.
Michael Eden Hill, he, him.
All right, thank you.
Hi, James Valdez, he, him. Oh, he's a team member.
Teresa, she, her. Nicole Spencer, she, her.
Alan Ippolito, he, him.
Jenny Hall, she, her.
Marami Harris, he, him. And Mark Arienzo, he, him, climate jobs.
Mackenzie Mitchell, she, her.
Micah Meskel, he, him.
Maya Hyam, she, her.
Margaret Johnson, she, her.
Last but not least,
Junior PCEF staff member, she, hers.
Are you going to drive?
Yes, I'll drive.
Okay. All right, well, I just wanted to note that we do have a slight change to the agenda. Before we get going, we originally had public comment at the end of the meeting, and if it works for the committee, we're going to move that up to the front of the meeting and just kind of shift things accordingly. So the first thing on the agenda is just a review of the minutes, and then to either amend or accept the minutes. Hopefully everybody had a chance to look at those that were sent out last week. If not, you have a copy in your packets if you wanted to peruse over them now. And just because we do have new members, I'll note that with this body has been operating on kind of a consensus model. So somebody, and there, where there is dialogue, and then just sort of generally approving things and having a slightly less formal, not using Robert's Rules of Order. Staff has been mostly facilitating to date. So if you do have a comment or you want to talk, we've been either raise your hand or flip your name card on its side, and I'll make sure and keep track of who wants to talk when and make sure that everybody gets a chance. So are there any changes to the minutes? Okay, well then I think that we can invite public comment. I know that we have one person who signed up to give public comment, but I did want to ask if there was anyone on the telephone who was interested in giving public comment.
One second, let's see. Okay, the phone lines are unmuted. Anyone on the phone who'd like to give public comment?
No, thank you.
All right. Okay, well then I'd like to invite Alan up. And if there's anyone else in the room who wants to give public comment, really just raise your hand. You don't have to have signed up on the list.
Thank you. My name, for the record, is Alan Ippolito. I work for a nonprofit organization named Verde in Northeast Portland's Cully neighborhood. In the words of my friend and yours, Ray España, it's a blessing to be here with you today. I'm here briefly to just reflect, to celebrate, and on behalf of the PCEF Coalition to support your work. So Verde, we are a member of the coalition. You know about our coalition a little bit, but I wanted to share some of the leadership from our coalition: Native American Youth and Family Center, Portland NAACP, Coalition Communities of Color, Apano, Opal, and our organization, as well as mainstream environmental organizations like Audubon, Sierra Club, Columbia Riverkeeper, Vision for Social Responsibility, and 350 PDX. And so to reflect to y'all, I want to be very clear that throughout this process, as we were doing all this work, we had a really strong idea of what we wanted to do, but at every step of the way, we had to figure out how we wanted to do it, how we were going to do it, whether that was to craft the initiative, to defend it in court, to collect the signatures, or to win in the general election. And then a year ago, implementation-wise, the same thing. We knew what we wanted to work on, but we didn't exactly know how we were going to, except for one thing. We knew we wanted to use the same community-led, frontline community-led process and commitment that we used throughout. And so today, in terms of celebrating, I'm here on behalf of the coalition to let you all know how happy we are to see this great committee come together, and to let you know that we're very excited to support you and to work with you. But we're looking to you as a committee to guide us on what's the right way and the appropriate way, the how of working together with you. We deeply respect the new roles that you've all assumed, the responsibilities that you've signed up for, and your roles as public officials now in implementing this measure that we worked so hard on. So just expressing a desire to work together, a desire to be supportive as a coalition, but that really we want to do so in a way that's transparent and accountable and respectful of the processes you're creating, and are looking for guidance from this committee over time to show us the right way, and we look forward to that dialogue.
Thank you.
Mhm.
If you don't mind, if I could just, given that we have you here, if I could just ask, do you have any ideas on some of the areas where you see some of those near-term collaborative opportunities for the community and coalition?
Sure. Well, it's going to be really important to, in the language of the initiative itself, it talks about creating workforce and contracting equity standards that ultimately lead to an agreement that grantees have to affirm and execute. And we were very purposeful. Early drafts of the initiative actually had numbers, like, want to see this percentage, that percentage. And we realized that that was really going to be the committee's work together with community afterwards. So we would welcome the opportunity to be a part of that process and more generally to share whatever experiences we have in identifying new resources to help guide the work. And there wasn't really a lot out there. There really wasn't a climate justice measure out there for us to model what we were doing after. So we had to pick bits and pieces of what folks had done before, and then we had to apply social justice and civil rights approach to things that maybe had never approached their work that way before. So one, we'd appreciate the chance to be engaged in the workforce and contracting equity standards, and then beyond that to help identify resources that can inform some of the good work that you have ahead, where maybe a lot of that work hasn't been frontline community led in the past, and you're going to have to develop new content to direct resources ultimately to new beneficiaries. Thank you, appreciate it.
Actually, probably next.
I'd like to do this every time.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, for the folks on the phone, we're going to go to slide number 6, which is governance. So today's the first meeting of the full committee, and if you looked at the material that was sent out, I'm sure you're all fully aware that you have a tremendous amount of work to do and material to get through, and so we would like to suggest that the committee staff is recommending to the committee that you consider delaying the work associated with development of detailed governance and bylaws to give yourselves a little bit more time together as a group, and until we're kind of through with the heavy lift of the work that needs to get done to be able to develop a request for proposals that we want to get out the door in early spring of 2020. For now, staff, along with external resources that we can contract as needed or requested, can work with the full committee and individuals as appropriate and as desired to set agendas and also to run the meetings. Any thoughts on that, Andrea?
I have a question about the modified consensus model, and as a stickler for process, I'll just say I'd love to see the group decide on a decision-making process in a formal public meeting prior to making decisions that we are then going to get funding out of, so that it's 100% clear that we all understand and the public understands when we're making a decision and we're not.
Absolutely, and if I could, and I will say that there was, and we can definitely provide this material and perhaps revisit it again at the next meeting, but the group of the 5 original committee members had a presentation kind of about a consensus model versus a modified consensus model versus just a sort of traditional majority rules, and then decided, but they were just making that decision for the purpose of nominating the next 4. And so that as sort of an interim measure. I think that what we were suggesting is that you might stick with that modified consensus model as a way of making decisions, but certainly that is your decision. And Andrea? Oh.
I think I just want to echo that concern as well. I think I'd be more comfortable if I knew the timeline for when we want to develop a detailed bylaws, and if it's possible to have an outline of what those bylaws could look like, earlier. So I think that would be very helpful, those two things. And then I think just a question around clarity on what modified consensus is would be great.
So I can give you a brief description, but we can definitely revisit it at the next meeting with a little bit more detail. The modified consensus, under a modified consensus model, any member can make a proposal, and then that proposal is discussed, and the committee members sort of have 3 voting options. 1, they can agree. 2, they can stand aside, which means that they have concerns, which hopefully have been voiced and discussed, but they're willing to have a vote of stand aside, which is not a yes, but it means they'll allow it to pass, or they can have what's called a block vote. In a true consensus, a block vote is essentially any member has veto power. In a modified consensus, it can be 1 or some number that the group decides on can kind of essentially have a block vote, but the measure can still pass. And so what we had suggested and what the body of 5 had agreed to do for the purpose of nominating the next 4 was a modified consensus where measures or proposals could pass with 1 block. But other than that, would need to be amended.
And sorry, just a follow-up question to that. How do we deal with members who are absent?
It's members who, I think that has not been discussed as a group. We have, when we had just the first 2 meetings, we had everybody present, and so it wasn't really an issue. I think that this, I imagine that, well, this body of 1 needs a quorum to be able to meet, so that's 5 of you, and that you would use a modified consensus of the people who were present and able to participate. Shanice?
I'll also offer in this space where there might not be full consensus. I don't know if there's an opportunity in this next meeting to parse this out, but what it means to maybe look at the core principles of PCEF, of the ballot initiative language, and how we might be reflecting on decision making in those moments based off of those specific goals and outcomes we're working towards, and that center racial equity in our ultimate principles that we're going to start to unpack. So I'm thinking that's what I would like to explicitly have via our process, and whether it's in this eventual bylaws or next meeting minutes, kind of articulating in that space where there isn't a shared consensus or a block vote, and how we operate and move from that is with this filter of the principles outlined in the ballot initiative.
Yeah. So I think what, I appreciate the comments. I think when we hit into this next slide here, as we discuss the timeline, I think part of what we've been trying to negotiate, navigate is, and we'll touch on it here in the next slide, will be the timeline. And so we're gonna make an ask of you all here in a little bit, and that'll, I think I almost wanna put a pause to almost come back to some of these questions that folks have. And revisit them after we discuss the timeline, because I think that it does have an interaction with sort of what we're trying to accomplish in the near term, and how much time we're going to want from you.
Yeah, and if I could just respond though to Ranfus's request for a sort of a bylaws outline. There is a template that the city of Portland uses, and we certainly can send that out annotated with kind of where all of the decision points, kind of the minimum decision points that the body would need to make. So it could be a relatively quick exercise, or if the body wanted to have a more kind of deliberative and thoughtful process around what their governance structure looks like, it could be a lot more involved. But we will send those out after this meeting. So this is where we get into timeline. Sam asked to say a few words kind of about the first year of the program before we get going.
Yeah. So I think from the outset, this program is, as I noted in the beginning, the first of its kind here locally, nationally, and likely globally as well. And at the same end, voters passed this initiative in November 2018, and we hit the 1-year anniversary last week. Our hopes and a lot of what we're operating on is we want to get, I mean, and this is coming from multiple directions, but the objective is to get money out this coming year, 2020. And so what we've presented in front of you and what we're working on in terms of a timeline is with the aim of getting dollars out the door in 2020. But that's going to have implications for the work that we do. At the same end, I think one thing I want to note now, and I'll continue to note this in each of our meetings, is this first round of dollars and this first round process is incredibly important. But it's also important to know that because this is new, because this is a new design in terms of how we deliver funds into communities, there's going to be a lot of learning that's going to happen. And I think it's important that we create space to acknowledge that learning is going to happen. And we're not going to get everything perfect, but we're going to continue to come back and iterate. And I want to just I want to acknowledge that that's an expectation within the staff. I think that's a clear expectation. We're going to continue to communicate to City Council and to the community at large. And so I say that to hopefully give you all a little bit of breathing room that everything isn't going to have to be perfect, and we're going to learn, and we're also going to have to move pretty quickly in order to get those dollars out so that we can learn and deliver on the benefits. And I may be going a little bit further here, and I'll add this one comment, but as folks know, and I think there's no reason to be shy about it, there's a tremendous amount of media scrutiny around this program. And on one end, we think that it's going to be incredibly valuable for folks to see projects happening on the ground. And so that there's a certain amount of urgency to do this right, but also get to that benefit so folks can start seeing those beautiful projects happen as well.
Yeah.
Can I add something? So I'm trying to marinate in the language of the initiative, and as I'm reflecting on maybe how conversations about the timeline are servicing here, I guess I'm trying to align myself with how that was determined. And I know there's a slice, right, that we're going to unpack first, and not necessarily be distributing all of the funds at once. As we think about capacity building for communities of color, getting ready by, was it March, for RFPs, and what does that look like through the course of winter holidays to be effective in the ways that the initiative calls for? And I guess I'm just throwing that into a space to process this timeline. And so we're operating in a fast-paced kind of mindset. And I think there are implications to what that means to capacity building for communities of color in the city. And with my community engagement hat, this is just something I've been sitting with for a little bit. But.
Michael?
I'd also like to get some updates from the community organizations that have been working on this. I've been attending some of the events. I was working on capacity building committee before the appointment to this committee. So I know they've been doing a lot of work out there, and I haven't personally gotten any updates on where they're at with preparing the community for it, where they're at for preparing people to start getting ready for grants, for building partnerships out in the community. And I know they've been working on it really hard. I know that there've been meetings, I've attended a few of them outside of here. And so I know it's happening. I just don't know where they feel that they're at in that capacity building process and in that grant making process. So if we can get some feedback from those different PCEF committees that are out there, community committees, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, what I'll just from an agenda perspective, what we'll touch on today, I want to bring it back to some of these points because June Reyes will be coming up next. We'll be presenting you sort of the outreach and community engagement plan, and we will touch on some of those elements, not all of them, but I want to assure you that we are certainly planning and thinking through capacity building, acknowledging it's going to be a long road in terms of making sure we build that capacity over time in a robust manner.
So slide 7, and we are going to be pretty firm on the timeline tonight, just because we have folks coming in to do presentations, and we don't want to push June's presentation, which was supposed to happen last meeting, to the next meeting. So I did So slide 7 has the timeline, and this is an optimistic timeline. It assumes no delays, and it really gives a minimum amount of time that an application period should be open, just in terms of, you know, grantees having the time to put these things together. If we're working back from a target of announcing awards in September 2020, that means that we need to release a request for proposal by the end of March or early April. Slide 8 has just a few points about the meeting schedule and the draft content that was provided in the memo B that was part of your meeting packet. With this September 2020 target in mind, staff provided this draft content for the next 7 meetings, and that's the memo titled PCEF Committee Draft Content and Agendas. We're looking for feedback and we're looking for guidance from committee on the length and the frequency of meetings. So right now you're meeting for 2 hours. Could you potentially meet for 3 hours? Right now you're meeting in the evenings and on weekdays. Is that something that works for you? And also looking for feedback on the content. We recognize that the proposed agenda for the first 4 meetings does not allow very much time for discussion, and that the schedule makes it hard to fit in additional material that may be brought to light during committee discussion. We do not expect that any decisions will be made at those meetings with so little time for kind of information gathering and thinking and consideration and deliberation. And so built in kind of additional time to come back to those subjects and have more time for deliberation and discussion in the February meetings. But I just wanted to kind of make sure that that was clear. So I know because I spoke with Robin earlier this week that he has some thoughts, and so I'd like to turn the stage over to him to share some of his concerns and suggestions.
Thank you, and I want to thank the staff for putting all this together. I know it's a tremendous amount of work, and what I'm about to say is not meant to be critical of the overall process, but just share some of my concerns and offer some suggestions for the rest of the committee to ponder. First concern is, I think, as I understand MOB correctly, this process calls for public deliberation. Calls for public.
It's not a commentary on your comments.
I thought I'm being so. Deliberation among this group of 9, and in my experience, deliberations with a group of 9 is just unbuilding. I think most optimal deliberations where you have good, thoughtful conversations, typically groups 2, 3, maybe 4, 5, maybe, but 9, I think it's going to be difficult to dive deep into some of these topics, particularly in a public setting, a public hearing. I'm still getting used to this format. Maybe others are more familiar with it, but concerned that, you know, some of us may be reluctant to share our priorities or share our voices in a public setting. Not to say smaller settings will be non-public, but it's just, you know. So public deliberation among a group of 9, I think, can be unwieldy. I think we also should take advantage of the expertise that is in this room. Each of us brings a certain degree of expertise in different areas, and we should tap into that expertise and guide us. Let those individuals with that expertise in that area guide us in, you know, certain topics. Instead of trying to make us experts or more knowledgeable people about every topic. So I think we should tap into that. And the third, again, if I understand the timeline correctly, the first time we start talking about the grant process is towards the end of January, which is just 2 months prior to when RFPs are going to be issued. And I think if we're considering, you know, $50 to $70 million and developing a process from scratch in 2 months, I think it's going to be rushed, and I think it's going to be woefully inadequate, and I think it's going to create problems. So, so that's my feedback. I have some suggestions, but I'd like to hear from other committee members to see if they share my thoughts or not, and if not, then I'll just shut up and fall into a corner. But yeah, would anybody have any other thoughts? Or?
Rampies? Oh, and Michael, sorry, I didn't see the other.
Keep forgetting to put that down. Do you sort of have thoughts?
All right, well, Rampies and then Shanice.
Well, thank you, Robin. I think you share some of your concerns. I think this is a quick timeline to develop a grant making framework. I think it's something we definitely want to try to get that right. So I think definitely more interested to hear what your suggestions are before I provide more feedback. But I think I'm open-minded in terms of the pace that we go within this committee to get that right. I think the agreement in terms of just tapping into the expertise here. Again, also, I'm cognizant to continue to tap into the expertise in the broader community where possible. Yeah, I think I'm just definitely really interested in your suggestions.
Shanice? This will just be really quick. I know we have some presentations, but I definitely am connecting with some of that. On the contrary, I do think the way we operate in decision-making, being accountable is important, and so there'll be some nuances to what that means to be public. But I actually think that's an important part of the work and how it's seen and displayed. The other piece, I think that the timeline, we're going to unpack a little bit of what that means in these presentations, and then I can maybe provide some more thoughts in the future. But my feeling now is that I do think it is a little rushed in its operating, or I think the implications are that we're operating and making decisions based off of needing to move fast. And I just want to be thoughtful about what that means for our process and recognizing this is just a pilot or first dip into the pot that we're doing first, but it's also doesn't mean, I guess, the timeline piece, if there is flexibility there, I definitely think that is going to help this group substantially.
Faith? No, Maria?
I echo some of the comments that you shared too. I know in the interest of expediency as well as quality, it's really important that we figure out a timeline that honors, the whole purpose of the grant program, and to make sure things are seen in the ground and that we build things and create things. But I am concerned with the size of this grant program. It's not something we can churn out overnight, and I also want to factor in some of the consultations we might want to bring in, like other people who can help us with our own capacity building, other near peers or community members who might influence the process in some way due to some gaps that we might have currently. So I want to bring all that in, as well as think about setting feelers out there for programs and projects that community members want us to start thinking about, so we can write a grant program that also honors the capacity that community members have and what they have to offer as well. Because I don't think it hurts to see what people would love to be funded for and see how that could potentially influence the work that we're doing. Because I would hate to develop a program that doesn't honor the existing capacity and brilliance and offerings that the community has right now. So the timeline's tough, but I think there's wonderful people in the room and people we can bring into the room who can help us get there.
One point of correction, and it's more a clarification. I just want to add, because I know we didn't touch on, we're touching on the timeline, but it's something that it's important to note. From the fund perspective, this coming year in 2020, what we're projecting to have to distribute, this is because this is a new surcharge, and as it's a new surcharge, it's what Revenue Division has given us certain comfort in terms of giving us. So we're expecting for this initial distribution to be in the range of $6 to $8 million. So $6 to $8 million is a tremendous amount of money. But in the grand scheme of when the program is fully implemented, the range will be closer to that $54 to $71 million. And we will have access to that pool of funds in early 2021.
Robin, did you want to share some of your suggestions?
Yeah, I think, well, thanks for sharing that. It helps put things in context about the amount of funds that we're talking about. I think one suggestion is to make some of this process in parallel instead of just a series A, B, C, D. Form subcommittees that can work in synchrony with each other. So we have some of them that working on some of the 6 or 7 categories, and subcommittee perhaps on the grant making process, so subcommittee, whatever we choose, but have some of these efforts kind of go in parallel. And then in the subcommittees, that's where we dive deep, and that's where we tap into the expertise that we have in this room, and have small working groups where they sit down, talk about the details, hear what the challenges and needs are, and make a recommendation to bring back to the full committee, and then we can deliberate at a higher level at the full committee. And then I think, and one of the committees I would recommend, based on some of the feedback that I'm hearing here, is have a committee that's focused on the grant making process, and maybe Michael mentioned some concerns about the capacity of the community in terms of supporting that. So maybe something along those lines, where this committee would work on, in parallel with everything else, the grant making process, just look at the grant making process. So, yeah, that's some suggestions that I have to offer.
I just, because this connects another model that could complement, if there's a work session type format that has an extended, maybe our meetings can be extended, and there's a work session component and a smaller component where we have the formal meeting. I think that could be a place to really be able to unpack and still have those processes coupled together, if that makes sense.
Megan? Made eye
Yeah,
contact
my
for too long.
understanding is a lot of boards like ours operate with those two infrastructures, subcommittees and work sessions. So I think they're pretty logical steps. I completely echo all the kind of concern about fast pace. I really want to dive in on the area that I feel like I'm bringing, and I wanted to think about, well, I know speakers who come and talk about it. I know some cutting edge climate research on some of it. So I guess, but I wasn't sure where to like dive deep. So just feeling like there are places where I know how to do that helps. Yeah, so I'm hoping, I think those two ideas are very practical and well-established ways that could work, unless we come up with something even better.
I think what we'll do is we've certainly as staff, having heard a little bit of this, having expected some of this, we've thought through a little bit of this already, but I think what would be helpful is for us to come back in our next meeting with a little bit more of a thought out proposal in terms of how we can have sort of a couple different tracks where we're able to bring you in. There's a few different ways in which we can do it, certainly some of which is just working with individual experts on the agendas associated with a particular meeting, and there's subcommittees and work sessions. And so we'll try to come back and figure out what is the right blend, given given staff capacity as well. So if that works, I think we'll do that. But one certain aspect I know that we had in coming here and thinking about the discussions we wanted to have collectively with you all is whether 2 hours is 2 hours is sort of when folks applied to be on the committee. It said 2 hours per meeting for the first 2 months, for 2 meetings a month, and then you all decide your schedule. We'd love to look around and get an initial feel for whether we can push that to 3 hours for our meetings, recognizing that that is a lot. So we want to see if that's something that you all would be open to. Not necessarily the entire duration, but certainly at least these next several months.
Robin?
I think as long as, obviously I can't speak for everybody, but I think for me, if there is a degree of flexibility that can be built in, and we don't always have to meet the group, we can conference in as needed. If there's a degree of flexibility, I'm personally willing to step up. But again, I don't want to speak for anybody else.
Right, please.
Likewise.
Faith?
I find that 3-hour work sessions are difficult, and I also understand that these are a lot to put together for staff. So I would definitely be available for 3-hour meetings because that's easier than 2 1.5-hour meetings, although I find that it's 90 minutes is a lot more work. And I don't think we really have a choice as far as, so I would encourage if there is any flexibility with the other committee members, that would really need to be more.
I'm gonna just echo on how supported I feel by you all, and just want to reiterate that this process has been very great, and I think this piece of whether or not we work longer, I think it's pretty responsible to say we have to do that, and there with the nature and level and of work that's to come. I'm not sure we can accomplish it with the intention that it was meant for in a concentrated period of time. So yeah, so some later meetings. I think that's a discussion on how late they can go, but I'm willing to go as late as it needs to.
Robin, I just wanted to confirm, when we talk about, when you talked about having flexibility, that may, I want to make sure I interpret that correctly so that we can come back and work on some of these options. But is that just the ability to call into a meeting? What else does that look like?
I mean, I think, yes, the ability to call in, that certainly helps, scheduling in as advanced as possible, that, certainly helps. I think also among us as a group, there's no, we all have lives, right? And acknowledging that if one of us can't make a meeting, life happens and is okay, right? So, no shaming because someone can't make a meeting, right? That type of stuff, right? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons that we wanted to try and get some content out to you, not just so that you could kind of have something to respond to and be able to give us feedback, but also so that we could start to figure out how many meetings we needed between now and March so that we could schedule them, get them all on your schedule as quickly as possible. And so what I'm hearing is that the committee is willing to work to add an extra hour and go probably until 9 o'clock for at least this sort of initial stream of meetings so that we can have more involved conversations. Staff will, will go back and kind of take the input that we heard today and apply it to the kind of quick plan B and plan C that we came up with this week and then get that back to you. But we do want to be mindful of your schedules and the holidays and travel and all of that and kind of get these on as quick as possible. Andrea, sorry, I didn't see your flipped up thing there.
No problem. I'm happy to meet for 3 hours if what we accomplish in that is giving time for conversation. I think that we end up spending that time filled with presentations and learning and miss the opportunity to gather all of the information and wisdom in the groups that we've not used our time on.
And I just want to add that the longer meetings to me may not be necessary if we do the work group and work sessions and subcommittee route. That might actually provide the space for conversation and deep learning. And then maybe the formal meetings, actually 2 hours is fine, I don't know, but something to maybe be open to.
So if staff comes back to you with a couple of different proposals next meeting, which it's looking like it's going to be early December, and then we can, if neither of those are good, then we will just have to stay for however many hours it takes to figure out what the plan is that we all agree on. And go from
Bodies who operate that way, who have significant charges, and so. Right, that's a discussion and a commitment to reflect on, but I think honoring the work that needs to happen, which will unfold through understanding what steps look like after these presentations. I just wanted to offer that. I'm not feeling limited by hours. I'm just more concerned on the work that needs to be done.
All right, well, with that, I would like to invite June to come up. For those on the phone, we're on slide 9. June Reyes is a member of the PCEF startup team and is focused on outreach and engagement. I'm going to give you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here talking to you. So again, for the folks on the phone, My name is June Reyes, and on the PCEF team, I'm focusing a lot on outreach. And so what I wanted to do with our time was give you all an overview of the goals and our target audience for sort of our outreach plan, noting that a lot of these are really driven by the ballot initiative and reaching the folks who are the intended beneficiaries of the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And then I want to talk about sort of these 3 different tracks of engagement. One of them being program development, which the decision makers is this PCEF committee. So I really wanted to sort of tee up a conversation with you all about how you'd like to bring community feedback into your decision making. I think that's sort of a conversation that we've been having for the last 20 minutes. So really thinking about ways that you want to see that reflected in some of the tools that we're bringing, such as memos or reports. So let's get started. All right, so the general goals of the public engagement plan for PCEF is to create awareness about the Clean Energy Fund, particularly those at the front lines of climate change. Second is provide meaningful opportunities for folks to engage. And 3, really promoting equitable partnerships and community building. So I think this 3rd piece kind of speaks to this being a community-led initiative. And so not letting go of just folks knowing about this program, but building space where people can build relationships. And because we're looking for more than just transactional projects. Oh, and slide number 11. I also wanted to bring up these sort of principles for equitable engagement. So we know that throughout this process, we're going to have to building trust and lead with equity. And that's pretty clear in the ballot initiative and sort of what we're trying to practice on our team and I think on this committee. So some of those that I wanted to highlight are just making sure spaces are accessible, as well as the material that we have, really honoring knowledge. And so I think that for this committee, that goes back to how are we giving community feedback full consideration? I think that can happen through what staff kind of put together in different avenues, but as well as this committee. Again, providing meaningful involvement and going back up one to the anti-racist practices. So some of these things below, such as centering frontline communities of color, low-income communities, as part of the anti-racist practice, bringing in stories of non-dominant narratives into the space. And so again, that's how we would bring community feedback in. And really, you know, a lot of it goes into fostering systems change. What are we doing, even as staff, to foster some systems change around how we do work as a bureau and kind of advocate for that as well. I also want to point to this last piece around sharing information. Well, a big piece of this is going to be accountability and transparency. And so how are we putting things up on our website? How are we making materials accessible to folks? And we're going to be adding some staff capacity around communication, so that will become stronger. But it also is a piece of engagement and outreach, is this piece around communications. And it's a little difficult to see up there, but these are some, you know, blocked neighborhoods. You know, the neighborhoods are a little bit smaller in area that the Portland Housing Bureau uses. And so really highlighting those neighborhoods in East Portland that have a high number of people of color. So you have that in the blue. And then the shaded red are areas with high poverty rates. And so those are some of the areas that we'll be focusing some of our engagement on. And I think also, as we pay attention to the projects that come in, looking at some of those target areas will be important. Oh, slide 13. So there's a lot going on here in terms of strategies and tactics, but some of the things that I wanted to point out is highlighting, you know, the piece around building relationships. We're going to be having a relationship manager model as staff so that we are able to follow up with folks. I think a lot of building trust and relationships with folks is being able to show up and continuing to follow up, continue to invite people to the table, even if we can, you know, even if folks can't come, where it's a consistent no and continue to learn. Another piece to point out is, you know, when we're thinking about a space to envision what's possible, how do we engage with storytellers and artists to help tell the story and be part of what we're trying to accomplish here, because a lot of it is also cultural change that we're looking for. So these are, these are kind of big topics, but there are some different tactics and ways that we want to embed that in there. And lastly, it's, we have strong community organizations who have been supporting this initiative as a community-led initiative. How do we co-sponsor events and co-host them and support folks who want to talk about PCEF and really, just partner on events and show up. All right, slide 14. All right, so this one's a little difficult to see, but I have on the last page this sort of long-ish timeline based on the one that y'all had seen. So if Katie, you could just kind of like wave the arrows around. The top green bubbles kind of represent those milestones that we're trying to achieve. And we know that fast timeline for the program development is between now and basically February. So how do we have engagement that kind of tracks to that, so that there's community feedback kind of looping into the decisions that are being made so that you all can consider it. But also there are different two other tracks that we've identified that folks can engage in. So one is program development. So that's the grant criteria and workforce equity plan that you all are coming up with, and you all are the decision makers on that. The second area is building community capacity. So I think that was what you were speaking to, Michael, about how are we getting folks ready? And that is sort of split out into a few tracks there. So when we're building community capacity, we're looking at providing capacity building workshops and grant technical assistance. And that we see as aimed for folks who are ready to apply in spring 2020 or 2021, maybe folks that just need a training or two to feel like they can step into providing a good proposal. And then the next sort of tier for this building community capacity is just kind of getting the community involved in community visioning. What projects are possible? What are things that we can envision together? And then this third one is targeted at folks who, who don't know if they're interested in applying, but they're definitely folks who want to serve and beneficiaries that the initiative wants to serve. And so for this, we're trying to really think through how do we bring in, based on a lot of input that we've heard so far, organizers into this space to help come up with projects and help build their capacity to be able to eventually maybe being able to just take a couple capacity building workshops if they feel ready to engage in a project. So what that might look like is, anything from, putting together cohorts of smaller organizations, and the cohorts maybe are made up of organizers, and they sort of come through a program that like PCEF offers, or maybe a different organization offers. But the idea there is to really get folks who are going to need a lot more to be part of PCEF. And so that timeline is more of like a 2 to 3 year intentional timeline of bringing folks through that process. And the third one is, again, the communications and storytelling piece. That's going to have to happen throughout this entire piece. And there's also a lot of opportunities for engagement for folks to be in that. And so I'm going to go to the next slide, because that kind of explains more of those 3 engagement areas I'm talking about. And focus is really on showing who the decision maker is. And so I want to focus a little bit more on this program development piece, because that's where you all really come in and can really, it's really important to know how you'd like community feedback to influence how you're thinking about the decisions you're making. So on to slide 16. So I broke this up into 2 pieces, but I forgot to kind of slice that first column there. So the first decision around grant evaluation criteria. Some of the influencers for your decision making that I've identified are, we're going to be doing research and consultations to include in those committee memos. So we had 3 different memos for this meeting. You know, it's up to you all if you want to guide us to do specific stakeholder interviews or consultations with folks so that we can bring that to you. We're also going to be having some sector-based meetings to do some around outreach around, for example, if folks want to talk around green infrastructure, having a meeting around that and giving you all sort of a report on how that went. The committee meetings is also a way to influence you all, right? So public comment and invited presentations. So what kind of presentations would you like us to bring to you? The other one is a public meeting. You know, if we have a public meeting, we would provide report back on feedback that we got. And lastly, we're thinking about using focus groups for populations that haven't been engaged, but who are called out specifically in the initiative, especially in the short timeline, to get some of their input. And recognizing that there's this challenge of, in that way, of being transactional, because we're trying to extract this information from folks to launch the PCEF program in these 3 months. And so I think that's just a challenge and piece that we're going to have to think about as well. And then similarly, for coming up with a workforce equity plan, it's pretty much the same influencers, except, you know, we're thinking about a contractor stakeholder group meeting, just because we know that it's going to take a lot more time to kind of debate, depending on what you all are interested in learning or finding out, or sort of the legwork that you're interested in, that would kind of fall into there. And so, in summary, the feedback flow of information that you all will be getting are 1, committee memos, and these are informed by our staff research, consultations, public meeting feedback, focus group reports, stakeholder group meeting summaries. In the committee, so folks voting in public comments, folks submitting email comments, and, you know, intending to do regular outreach report back, saying like, hey, here are some of the meetings we've been having, et cetera. And the third is really, you know, what kind of presentations would you like us to bring to you? And I think that some of this is going to change based on the model that we end up choosing, but I think getting general guidelines would still help us form a proposal to bring back to you around how community feedback is incorporated into your process. And some of these questions, discussion questions, shouldn't surprise you, because I've been teeing these up, but I just wanted to open it up because generally what I'm asking is how does staying accountable to receiving and fully considering community feedback look like to you? I think that's just the general question that I have here.
So, and Marie, I do see that you have a comment. I did just want to note the time that 7:01, so we can probably go about 5 minutes over and have 10 minutes of conversation, but then our next presenter is here and we do want to give enough time for that presentation too. Go ahead.
June, for your presentation. This definitely creates a lot more clarity for me to see what y'all are working on and how this can really support our committee's work. I think whenever possible, regarding accountability, it would help to have like disaggregate data whenever possible. And when we're talking about POC communities, we're calling out Black communities, Black neighborhoods, you know, Native and Indigenous people, whenever possible. I think the list of your goals is great, and I think we could also have a little bit more room to be explicit about populations we intend to serve better. And I think in terms of what presentations and what experts we might need to engage. Working in other grant programs, I've seen lots of community projects die or get stalled because city or state policies actually don't allow some of that work to happen. So when it comes to green infrastructure, communities want to build certain stormwater amenities or certain types of features in the street that city or state policy actually prohibit that. So they're sitting on grant money that they can't actually implement. So I'd like to see if there's anything in the city of Portland that might be a conflict in terms of policy or process that would hold some of these aspiring grantees back in implementing the projects and to have a reality check sooner than later. So either we can amend codes or change policies and figure out how do we move forward. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
That microphone is not responding. It's
So-
not giving me a light, it's not giving me a signal. I don't know what happened there, but I apologize.
Robin?
Yeah, real quick, thanks. I think getting feedback kind of firsthand is always great. So to the degree that you can, if you can share with us an email or a calendar when some of these meetings are happening, and it'd just be nice to, at minimum, just if we're available, kind of attend and be, sitting on the wall and just kind of listening in. So yeah, let us know when some of these meetings are happening so we have the ability to just sit in and observe firsthand.
Megan?
Yeah, I have a couple comments, not really in any order, but reflecting on the map you showed, I think I'm understanding that that's a place you imagine future projects targeting, not necessarily indicating only outreach. I just had a couple reactions on the map, and that areas that have already experienced major gentrification and displacement don't show up on that map, and I wonder if we're missing potential important target communities. I'm thinking in the Black, Northeast Portland didn't show up on that map, but still may. So I guess I'm just wondering how. Just a thought I have is that map might kind of ignore neighborhoods just because they've experienced displacement, but there may be still existing communities within those neighborhoods. A thought. I was also wondering about renters and affordable housing, existing affordable housing buildings, and where they fit in this conversation. Because it seems like a really important potential target audience for future. And so I'm just wondering if we have maps of rental units, naturally, quote unquote, naturally market rate affordable existing units, and also subsidized units. I think that would be helpful information. Not sure where that all fits in here. I'm also curious, I think Maria mentioned something about it would be really good to know what communities hold up as existing example projects that they think are really successful for the goals articulated in the grant project, because I think they can help us think through what future projects could look like. So whether those have been nonprofit or if they've come from, I know we've kind of described PCEF as unique, but if it's building on a history from the clean energy works and there's been state projects that have been other work I think we can learn from. So I'm just curious if we can bring some of that learning in, and particularly from people who've possibly been beneficiaries or not been because of but not equitable practices. So I would just be curious to learn from past practices or other places that maybe are trying similar things. I'm saying a lot of things, and I had one more comment on, two more comments, sorry, I'm trying to be really quick. Keep fast. I also, it's a little cart before the horse, we haven't talked about the grants much yet, but I'm thinking there's got to be different tiers of grant funding, particularly recognizing that some community members that may be most in need from an equity lens may not be the most ready for full capacity, but I think there's probably roles for different grant tiers or types to try to respond to those different preparation levels or different formal levels or size of communities. I haven't thought that through a lot yet, but I'm just curious if I think that feeds into some of the engagement and thinking through what different tiers and types of grants might be out there, or that we might think about as we develop our grant idea. I don't think they all have to be the same kind of grant size and approach, because that might accidentally block out communities. I like the cohort model a lot. And I don't know, a group on here that doesn't really fit in necessarily from an equity lens, but I think is an important group to consider are landlords, because they certainly are groups that I know we want to be really conscientious per Councilor Hardesty's advice. Like who's benefiting from the project, but we do want landlords to be motivated to participate in the project, especially if they're landlords of affordable housing. So I'm just curious about their input along the way and what's going to make PCEF projects attractive to them, but also still we're about to still accrue where we want them to. So I have a lot of thoughts. Those are some trying to be fast and share the wide range of what I'm having.
Grant, please.
Thank you, June, for all the work that's been done to develop this, and I think this is really helpful. I just want to echo some of the statements made by some of our other committee members. When I think about how we are held accountable to fully receiving and considering feedback, I think it's important through each stage of this that that we're not only just receiving the feedback, but that we're also being assessed by some of those participants. So ideally I would love to see before the application goes live, that there is input on the application. I want to make sure it's something that makes sense to users, and try to look at that in many different lenses. But I'd also like to make sure that folks are assessing how the process went for submitting an application, to how the community assesses us in terms of the full grant making process in our decisions. So I think sort of just want to highlight that. And then I think in terms of guidelines for committee members, like I hope we can sort of engage some key stakeholders, agencies, so like hopefully that will be engaged with Bureau of Labor and Industries, with their state apprenticeship programs, how do they assess their apprenticeship programs and other workforce development programs. Yeah, I think it can as well as Oregon Department of Energy, how they sort of provide grants for their energy projects, how do we engage with other social justice foundations as well. But I will try.
Great. Faith, and then I think unless anyone has any burning comments, we're gonna turn it over to Kyle.
Excellent, thank you. And I just want to thank all the comments. I agree with everything that's been said. It's for everybody who's already made some comments. So very quickly, I just wanted to offer that I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity that Toledo offered and hearing from the coalition and what their ideas were in generating this initiative. So I don't know if we've had that opportunity yet or if you have that planned in the next series, but it would be really wonderful to hear from the coalition members on what their thoughts were when they were developing this idea.
I do have something burning, but it's quick. I appreciated what was shared and won't reiterate any of that. I do think having an advisory structure like that we respond to, it doesn't have to be a formal space that meets, but who are some elders, who are some folks from the coalition that we unpack the criteria we're about to vote on before we vote on it and have that feedback loop that's continuous. And I'll end there because I'm about to start.
Before we invite up Kyle, I just wanted to thank you all, and also this is going to be continuing an iterative process, so you are always more than welcome to call me and email me, so the comments don't stop here.
All right, I'd like to invite Kyle Duesner. He's a colleague of ours at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to give you all a little presentation. Oh, that's your phone. I almost took it home with me. Kyle's presentation has a lot of content in it, and so it makes it's scaled back, but it's still a lot. And so it's going to it makes sense to ask, I think, clarifying and explanatory questions kind of throughout. But in terms of questions that really like kind of lead to or spark a bigger discussion, we'd ask that you hold those until the end, just because there's a lot of information.
Yeah. Okay. You might sit in the middle. You guys are staying?
Yes, we're staying. I'm gonna flank you here.
Do you want me to sit there so I can advance?
Just in case I can hit you.
Yeah, that's always good.
Unplug things before everything blows up here. Hey, June, if I unplug this speaker, will the people on the phone be gone? I don't understand. Because it's not sitting over here. What is it?
Is it coming in?
It's not, it usually just pops up.
I'm not very good with the mouse. USB drive right there.
Okay. And
Which one? PCEF. Right in the middle. Thank you. Should we wait a minute for? Wow.
Sure.
Oh. Uh-oh.
Yeah, no,
I'd like to thank Kyle for causing a technology problem before we get going again.
Great if we could get it on there because some of the charts take up the whole screen. Perfect.
So this slide deck is the same as what you have in your packet, just has a couple of extras if there are questions at the end.
Do you want to move that closer so I can advance it?
I don't think I can. You can sit where I'm sitting.
Does this make it almost?
No, but you can drag that one over.
Really want that. I like to be in control of the computer. This is working, right?
Oh, yeah, I said it's working.
Okay, cool.
Doesn't have a light.
Should I wait or get started?
I think you should probably get started.
Okay, great. So my opening comments that I wanted to hear. So you'll have to relay how excited I am to be here to share this information with you all, and to just say that it's really an honor to be here at the first convening of all the committee members together. I'll tell you that everybody that we work with is so excited about what you all are embarking on and what you can all accomplish moving forward. So I'm glad to be here to share the work that I do. And this is really an open invitation to continue this conversation as we move forward. I'm doing this really high level, so we could drill down in lots of different areas here in the future. And so I thought I'd kind of do an overview of everything, and then you guys can decide if you want to bring me back to talk about any of these other pieces. So I'm just going to jump right in. My name is Kyle Diesner. I'm a Climate Action Program Coordinator for the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I'm responsible for the city's emission inventories. We have a lot of emission inventories, so I've got, these are all community-wide inventories, sector-based emission inventories. Those are emissions that are produced in the City of Portland from tailpipes and power plants outside of the city. And natural gas combusted in homes and businesses, that kind of stuff. The consumption-based emissions inventory is also community-wide, but those are looking at emissions that are produced globally as a result of consumer demand from Portlanders. So, and then I also have operational inventories and a consumption-based inventory just for city government operations. I will not be talking about those today. Today, I'm going to focus on our sector-based inventory. I have a couple different sector-based inventories that I do just so I can see how they compare with different methodologies and have a better, fuller understanding of the big picture. This inventory that I'll be sharing with you tonight is what we have to report to comply with the international protocols around reducing carbon emissions at the local level. I'll also be presenting on our consumption-based emissions inventory, the original inventory that we published in our 2015 Climate Action Plan. So where do Portland's carbon emissions come from? They come from, this is a sector-based approach, so looking at the transportation sector, the commercial sector, the residential sector, and the industrial sector. We also have sources from landfilled solid waste, so the garbage that doesn't get recycled or diverted, but it ends up at the landfill, so the methane emissions that are produced from that, as well as fugitive emissions that escape from our natural gas system or from refrigerators or air conditioning units, that kind of stuff, as well as wastewater treatment. And so that's what's happening not only at Portland's wastewater treatment plant, but this is a county-wide inventory, so there's 3 other wastewater treatment plants in the county. And right now, we're really seeing transportation emissions dominate. They're up to 42% of the total emissions. Just a few years ago, in 2015, they were about 38%. So they are climbing. And really, I think this type of chart really shows how big of a deal that is. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail as I go forward. So these are the actual emissions by source rather than by sector. And for some people, this might be more meaningful. So the #1 source is electricity. So this is electricity use that is used in residents, in businesses, and in the industrial sector, as well as electricity used for transportation for electric vehicles. followed by gasoline, obviously a motor vehicle fuel. Natural gas is the third source there, used typically for home heating, but also HVAC equipment in commercial buildings, sometimes used in industrial processes as well, and for hot water heating. And then the fourth source there is diesel fuel. So again, another transportation fuel right at the top. One thing I want to point out is that if we were to pull out the natural gas from that electricity, the 28% electricity, if we pulled out the share of electricity that's generated from natural gas and counted it with the 20% natural gas there, natural gas would dominate as the single largest sources of emissions for Portland. And that's important to understand as we move forward, as we're really working towards net zero emissions by 2050. That will require removing natural gas from our economy. Just sit on that one for a second. These are our emission trend over time. So emissions have really declined in Portland pretty significantly, but they have plateaued in the last few years. And that variability you see since 2010 is really about hydro generation in the Pacific Northwest that rises and falls with rainfall patterns. So where we have years with much higher rainfall, we have higher hydro generation, those emissions drop. We have a drier year, those emissions go up. And you see a lot more variability now than we used to, because our grid is so much more dominated by hydro and renewable fuels than it used to be back in 2000 or in the 90s. The US emissions are in the blue. Those are also coming down. They're right about just slightly above 1990 levels today. But Portland, we're 15% below 1990 levels, so we have made significant progress in reducing emissions. But I am concerned by the plateau we've seen in recent years, and so we really need to accelerate our efforts if we're going to hit these targets. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, says that we need to reduce emissions 50% by 2030, 100% by 2050. So 50%, so that means we need a 35% reduction in emissions in 10 years, because 2019 is over. That is a daunting task, but all you guys are here to solve this problem. No, we're all in it together. We did see a big spike in emissions just in 2017, jumped up 6%. That was primarily the function of a really cold winter that year. You'll remember we had multiple snowstorms in 2017. So winter heating spiked. We had the highest ever natural gas sales in our history. We did, yes, for Multnomah County. We did see, in looking at the data of therms per person, for our last high heating year was 2008. And we're actually a little bit more efficient today, using fewer therms per person in 2017 than 2008. So it did spike, but our investments in energy efficiency are helping reduce the impact there. I expect that to drop back down with the 2018 and 2019 inventories as we had more moderate winters. So this isn't all a doom and gloom story, though. I would like to look at it this way to see those really sharp reductions per person as we've grown significantly. 38% more people in Portland, and we've reduced emissions 38% per person. So a person living in Multnomah County today uses 38% fewer emissions than they would have in 1990. Not uses, produces, sorry. So that's incredible progress. We've really, and that's success that we should be proud of, but clearly it hasn't been sufficient. As we're really seeing a plateau, we've got to accelerate our efforts. So this shows emissions by sector, comparing our peak. Portland peaked in 2000. We hope globally emissions peak in 2020 next year, so that's the international goal there. But we peaked well ahead of the rest of the globe. And so this compares from our peak to today. You can see significant progress reducing emissions in single family, residential, commercial, and industrial. Multifamily is a bit tricky. It's split between single family and commercial. It depends on the utility count and how they have their rate schedule split out. So there isn't a separate rate class for multifamily, so it kind of really varies. So I can't show you that exactly, but they're kind of between those two sectors. Industrial has also contributed the most to our emission reductions to date. And I'll get to your question just one second. Let me just finish my talking point. So in the industrial sector has contributed the most to our emission reductions, and that has primarily been the result of the loss of high energy intensity industrial activities around 2000. So we had aluminum smelting and other energy intensive industrial activities that closed down. And that was right at the time that our emissions peaked.
Just a clarifying
Yes,
question.
please.
The multi-family data you're talking about, is it reflected here or is within single family?
It's in single family and commercial. So some multifamily buildings, their common area, energy, lighting can be on a commercial account, whereas maybe their units are on a residential account. Some large residential buildings are sometimes on commercial accounts. So it does really vary, and the data isn't granular enough for me to break that out, unfortunately. It's aggregate data we get from the utilities.
And just to clarify, the industrial that disappeared, it reappeared elsewhere? You can.
I would assume so, but we don't have any way to know that for sure. What I can say is that in Portland, industrial jobs have remained really strong. Demand for industrial land has remained really strong. So it's not that we've had a loss of industry here, it's just that the industry has shifted to be less energy intensive. And hopefully that's what we're seeing globally. So, as these businesses, if they did move away, hopefully they're investing in efficiency and renewables and bringing down their impact elsewhere. Any other questions on this before I move forward?
Sir, can you clarify fugitive emissions?
Yeah, sure. So fugitive emissions are very hard to measure. They're modeled, and they're based on population typically. And so as we're a growing city, those estimates will continue to grow. So that's why you see that increase in fugitive emissions. So they come from a variety of sources. Probably the largest source is natural gas that escapes from our natural gas distribution system. So this happens, I had a natural gas company out recently, and they had their measurement in my basement, and they found all these points in my gas pipes in my basement where the natural gas was escaping. And they said, oh, it's not a concern, don't worry about it, it's not a hazard. Nonetheless, those are fugitive emissions that are contributing to climate change. And of course, natural gas is methane that is higher global warming potential than CO2. So it's something that we should be very concerned about. I will say that Northwest Natural has invested significantly in upgrading their entire distribution system. They're the only natural gas company in the entire United States that has replaced all of their pipes. So the fugitive emissions are really coming from people's properties on the other side of the property line, where the gas company does not go in and replace your personal pipes. Go ahead.
Question
Yeah.
from the previous slide. And it
Oh,
came up
okay.
quick.
Sure.
I think I saw it on our prep package, but I don't see it in today's slides.
I thought I saw it disaggregated by, per person by income or?
Oh,
any
that's
other?
later, and I will
Okay.
talk about that.
Sorry.
And just so to the folks on the phone, if we call on you all, we call your name. When Katie calls you out, she'll say Megan, and so it helps people on the phone know. But if we don't call on you all, just state your name for the folks on the phone.
And fugitive emissions also include model data around freon that is escaping from air conditioning units and refrigeration. So there are other sources there, but natural gas is the largest. So this is a small chart. It's not intended to be read. It's more intended to show the analysis that we did with ICLEI. They looked at the emissions that we had in our 2005 inventory to 2014, factors that would have driven up those emissions in red, and interventions that we made that brought those emissions down. So really digging into the contributions to our changes in emission trends over time. And this was really helpful. It helped us learn really where we were getting the highest impact reductions. So first of all, the number one thing was changes in the grid intensity, carbon intensity of the grid. And you see that in our emissions trend. That 10% swing up and down in those latter years are changes in grid carbon intensity. So number one, the carbon intensity of the grid. Number two are the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. So that is a factor of how much renewable energy is in each gallon of gasoline or diesel that is sold in the city. The VMT per person, so how much people are driving, vehicle miles traveled. Followed by kilowatt hour per job, so energy efficiency. 1/2 of all the electricity sales in Portland are for the commercial sector. So that is, a huge opportunity in the commercial sector to focus on energy efficiency. Also kilowatt hours per household and therms per household, regular old-fashioned residential energy efficiency still is as critical today as it was 25, 30 years ago. We've got a long ways to go on that front. And so how do we get to net zero by 2050? What does this data say? I'm going to give you some examples of the kinds, take that kind of wonky kilowatt hour per job. How do we turn that into some, like, what does that actually look like in terms of policy? So these are examples of the kinds of things that would move the needle. Not to say these are things we're doing or but they give you the flavor of it. So significantly reducing VMT, things like zero emission zones, congestion pricing. PBOT is working on pricing for equitable mobility right now, intended to address congestion pricing. Expanded transit access and service, so creating more opportunity for more people to ride the bus and get out of their cars. Decarbonizing the grid remains really critical. We've seen significant success with voluntary renewable energy purchases for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. So that, I think, remains a low-cost, effective measure. Community solar is a huge opportunity. We're very excited about seeing these larger solar systems go in that can really be community-owned and deliver those benefits right back to households, particularly low-income households. We also think there's opportunity to really incentivize or require commercial and industrial sector renewables. We've seen less adoption of renewables in those sectors, and they have bigger facilities, larger rooftops, and so that we think there's a lot of opportunity there. Also, as I said, half that electricity use is coming from the commercial sector, so it seems like a great fit for that. Decarbonizing buildings and transportation, so requiring electric heat, 100% renewable energy for new construction, update of our renewable fuel standards, so that's the amount of biofuels that we require in gasoline and diesel, and a stronger push for EVs, and FAVES is a wonky term, but it's fleet autonomous vehicles that are electric and shared. So really moving towards a future where people don't need to own their own cars, but that there are equitable, affordable transportation options in the form of fleet electric vehicles. Deep residential and commercial energy efficiency upgrades. Again, this is what we've been doing for so long. It's still as important today as it always has been. We have some major barriers for that for the city of Portland. We really have very low cost electricity, very low cost natural gas, and that has left very few incentives in the market, particularly for gas heated homes, to make energy efficiency upgrades. So there isn't really a lot of economic incentive or incentives in the market to force efficiency. So we really have to turn that around. And there are a couple ways that could be done. The city currently has a prohibition against requiring weatherization of buildings. And so the city charter would have to be changed in order for us to force people to do that. But we could price carbon, we could incentivize upgrades, or we could directly pay for upgrades. And that's something we may want to do for low income households. So that gives you a sense of the kind of things that we are looking at, the kind of challenges there. Really, to get to net zero, though, we'll have to focus on resilience and carbon sequestration as a really big new focus for our climate work. It's always been in our climate plan, but never a priority. To get to net zero, that really requires carbon sequestration. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to pivot to consumption-based emission inventories. But I thought I'd just check and see if there's any questions from anyone, or anyone on the phone too.
Yes, electric cars are coming. I heard that at least a few car makers will switch to completely electric vans like Nissan and Volkswagen and so on. Do you expect a big reduction in transportation emissions due to that?
So the question was whether we expect to see a big reduction in emissions from transportation as a result of electric vehicles. Yes, I certainly hope so. That's why I've noted a strong push for EVs. We can't move our entire vehicle fleet to electric and hit our targets though, and I think that's important to understand. That is moving a lot of demand to the grid that probably can't handle it, especially as the grid is becoming more renewable. So we need fewer cars, period. So we still have to have a strategy that reduces VMT, fuel switches, addresses land use challenges so that people live close to where they work and close to what they need, as well as electrifying the fleet. And all of these things have to happen together because there is no silver bullet here, unfortunately.
Maria?
Oh.
I just want to give a shout out to biking, walking is a way to reduce VMT. I know it gets easily left out, but
yes,
that's something that I wanted to call out specifically.
Yeah, that's a great point. I should add that up there. Thank you. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. And how long do you want me to save for discussion?
As much time as you can.
Okay. So this is my sort of my favorite little thing that I've been working on for the last several years here. It's very exciting and it's very emergent on a global scale. So there's cities are just starting to look at consumption-based emissions. And it's really sort of the new territory. We've been doing our sector-based inventories for 20 years, and this is the new frontier. It's really looking at the life cycle impact of stuff, all of the things we consume. So we use a model to measure this. It uses data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. They sample household consumer spending around the city, around the country. So in Multnomah County, they sample how consumers are spending their dollars, and then they track those dollars throughout the economy. And so we use data from them on final demand from households, governments, and businesses in terms of what they purchase for their own capital or inventory formation, not in terms of if it's a good that they're selling that's attributed to the household demand. The model uses dollars spent for 440 different types of commodities and looks at that by location and for Oregon, the US, and globally. And the model also includes our actual use phase and disposal phase emissions from our sector-based inventory, so that combustion of gasoline and diesel in vehicles, the use of natural gas in homes, electricity, and that emissions from disposal at the landfill. So those are integrated into our consumption-based inventory to really give us a full picture. Yes, Robin?
So just a clarifying question. So you're talking kind of the embodied carbon through the whole life cycle.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Consumption and disposal.
Yes, and I'll show you some charts on that too in a second here. So when we use this lens, and one of the reasons I really like this work is because when someone looks at our traditional sector-based inventory, they might say, oh, well, I have a home, I'm residential, I have some rolled air, and I have a car, maybe some share of those transportation emissions, but the rest of it is somebody else's problem. It really gives people an out. But when we look at it through the consumption lens, the individual is at the middle of this, where really they have a home, hopefully. Some, many don't, unfortunately. Goods, you know, they purchase goods, they buy food, they use services, they use transportation. So it really opens up a whole new realm of opportunities for individuals to reduce their emissions. But I don't want to make it sound that simple, because consumers are really locked into this level of consumption. And so much of this is actually systemic systems and capitalism that are driving consumption, marketing, these kind of things that are a little outside of the hands of individual consumers to control. When you, for example, you go to a restaurant, sometimes you're given much more food than you actually need to eat, and how much of that goes home with you and ending up as food waste. That's an example of where we don't always have as much control over how we'd like to consume as we may like. And so while this presents more opportunities for individuals to reduce their emissions, I just want to be sober about the fact that there are systems that really limit that. So this chart compares our sector-based emissions, 7.9 million metric tons, the red and the green, with our consumption-based emissions, which are the green and blue. those emissions are double the emissions we produce here in the city. And so you see that little red sliver, those are exports, so they're things that are produced here in Portland, so they're generating emissions here in the city, but they're to satisfy demand of consumers elsewhere, so they don't get counted in our consumption-based inventory. That big blue 9.4 million metric tons, all of that are imports, so things that we're buying and using that are produced elsewhere in the world. And what our model does, which I really love about it, it's very unique. Most cities don't have this level of detail with these consumption-based emissions inventories, but we're able to look at these by life cycle phase for those 440 different commodities. So what this data shows is that more than half, 56%, is from the production of that stuff, whereas 30% is from the use of that stuff. The use being your washing machine when you're washing your clothes, your electricity in your home, your gasoline in your car. So those are use phase emissions. And then we've got 10% from pre-purchase transportation. So that's that supply chain transportation that's happening as products are being produced. Wholesale and retail distribution is a small share there. And you can see post-consumer disposal, so what ends up at the landfill at end of life, is just a small sliver, less than 1% of those overall emissions. So focusing on consumption-based emissions really requires us to move upstream in how we look at the problem and to address production phase emissions which dominate. So for 30 years, we've been focused on these use phase emissions and disposal phase emissions. This really opens up a whole new suite of opportunities for interventions, both for local government and individuals. So I am working currently. Did you have a question?
I do have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
This is Michael. My question is for production versus use. Does use include the entire life cycle? So
no. So
for
this
example, an automobile is at 6% production, and then 31% is using it for the lifetime.
So this is on average across the entire consumption-based inventory. So that totally varies by product. So we will go. The next slide actually digs into that a little bit. But something I want to say before I advance is that we're currently working on a sustainable consumption and production strategy, which is our attempt to figure out what do we do with this data. And this is, so far, to date, has been a very internal conversation at the city, building our own internal understanding of this. And really, when I started these conversations with city staff, the general response I got is, oh, well, that's not our problem. We don't really have anything to do with this. But now the conversations have advanced to the point that we're really seeing the role that local governments have in these emissions across the board. And the ways that we influence this is pretty remarkable. And I could do a whole deep discussion on that, so I'm not going to go into that. But we are working on a sustainable consumption strategy right now, focused on building internal consensus around what that work looks like and what is the role of government. Starting in 2020, we're pivoting to a series of public workshops and community engagement to really co-create some solutions with the public around consumption-based emissions.
Maria, did you have a question or comment? No.
Okay, so this is to get at your question, Michael. So you can see for different types of commodities, whether the emissions are coming from production in brown or use phase in purple really vary. So for vehicles and parts, the vast majority of those emissions are coming from using those vehicles. So the solutions are really getting people out of their cars, getting them in more efficient vehicles, getting them in electric vehicles, but it's not so much about the production of the vehicles. Whereas if you look at food and beverages, the emissions are all coming from the production of that food, much less so how we prepare the food or the food that ends up in the landfill. So really food choice and what we choose to eat is the big issue there. So this data really helps us figure out where the life cycle emissions are coming from and where we can zero in on focusing different types of interventions. This is the chart, I think, that you asked about earlier, Megan. And so this is kind of part of the equity framework I'm using for working on our sustainable consumption and production strategy. So this is an on average from our consumption-based emissions inventory, emissions by household income So you can see that higher income households are contributing significantly more to climate change than lower income households. This is intuitive, we know this. And this is also true in terms of our sector-based emissions. It's high income households, businesses that are contributing the most to that problem rather than our low income residents who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. So it's incumbent on us to understand that and develop solutions that really acknowledge that dynamic. And so what I'm using as the framework for sustainable consumption is based on the work by Kate Rayworth and Donut Economics. And this is the last slide, so I'm gonna go quick through this so we have plenty of time for discussion. What Kate has proposed is that we really need a new way of thinking about the economy, and that sustainable consumption is about getting to this space, the safe and just space for humanity. The idea being that there's an ecological ceiling that if we consume beyond that, we get in this overshoot category with environmental impacts like climate change, air pollution, loss of biodiversity, etc. Most Americans are in that overshoot category today. The social foundation is the other critical component of this model. A basic understanding that all humans need to be above a basic social foundation so that they can thrive. And so today in Portland, there are at least 4,000 people sleeping on the streets tonight. I imagine it's actually significantly higher than that. So 4,000 people in Portland today that do not have homes. How many do not have energy, do not have water, do not have food, do not have adequate education or healthcare? So we have a real problem to solve, and I know that's why all of you are in this room. And so that is very exciting. So we need to really lift people up who have left behind, as well as bring down emissions from those higher income households. So we really have this dual problem, and we have to look at it holistically, both acknowledging the fact that many, many people, billions around the globe, have to consume much more than they do today. So that is incumbent on us then, to folks like me, to reduce our consumption so that we can all live in that safe space that is just for all humanity. And with that, I will wrap up and take your questions. And I'd love to come back and dig into all of this stuff with you more in more detail.
Megan?
I guess I have burning questions here. Yeah, I have a couple reactions. Thank you for that. It's been a little while since I've had an update on climate action work. I'm really glad to see the shift to the consumption-based emissions. I work a lot in food, and that was one entirely missed and sector-based before. And so I appreciate that your comments on the structural causes of some of our limitations, which is certainly true in transportation and also in food, and pretty much all of them. But I had some questions on carbon sequestration, how much work you all have done on thinking through that. I've been thinking through a lot on food production lately, soil management, for example. And then another question on that kind of last point you were driving home, and what I've been thinking about since looking through these notes is PCEF is in this position of like, how do we use the money to benefit poor, low-income, historically marginalized color groups, and yet they're not the ones causing the problem. So I don't think this is a question for you, it's more for all of us. It's like, there's also perhaps a role to go into mitigating some of the carbon being caused by wealthy people in here, but I don't know how you do that in a way that then benefits not wealthy people. I don't know, it's just a question I'm wrestling with, and it's perhaps on the workforce and who's getting paid to do that work, but I do think that's something to think about, because if we really want to make an impact on carbon, what's very clear to me is that we actually have to, like, it's wealthy households that are causing the problem. So I don't know, it's just something I'm wrestling with a little bit, particularly when I come to think of PCEF grant money.
Well, I'm going to use this opportunity to give you my opinion, even though you didn't ask for it, which is that this is why I've selected the donut economics model and why I wanted to share it with you, because it really does acknowledge that fundamental challenge. And I do think PCEF is perfectly positioned to be reducing overall emissions, but simultaneously lifting up and helping those communities thrive who have left behind. That is, from my perspective, kind of the charge before you. I'm totally speaking out of turn here, but so I really wanted to share this with you because I do think it's a really beautiful way to kind of think about this work and what we have to all figure out how to accomplish together. And I think PCEF, more than any other particular program I've seen, is really well positioned to do both of those things.
Do you have any thoughts about the carbon uptake? Or
the sequestration, yes.
Has the city or county been doing any work on analyzing
Yeah, so parks for a long time has been tracking the carbon sequestration benefits of our urban forests. And so that's something that they continually do on an annual basis. And then we're really now looking at, as you mentioned, soil sequestration and sequestration through food composting and other methods. So we're participating in some work groups with other cities through some of the city networks that we're involved in, C40, CNCA, to explore some of those issues. But as I mentioned before, it really is a new territory for us outside of the parks, who's been doing that work for a lot longer.
Sam and then Shanice.
And I'll just answer the question. This is the county piece, and the county, I know they just, because the county actually has more, not urban lands, but has more rural lands and lands that are forested further out east. So they're just starting to think about getting a better handle in terms of inventory of the potential from a sequestration perspective on rural ag and forest lands. But those are governed under a whole different range of laws and whatnot. So it's a different bucket, but certainly getting a sense of it.
Shanice.
Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciated the lenses and frameworks as we're unpacking this data. And I just for the committee, I want to maybe think about, and I'm resonating with what you shared around how wealth shows up, and I think framework that is connecting with me as I process this information is just the just transition theory, right? How we think about extractive economies that are operating in Portland and how they impact communities. So I see single user impacts to climate change as something that is not really a choice for the communities that we're centering through the ballot initiative. And so what does it mean to maybe disaggregate or unpack maybe some of how we're looking at wealth, looking at how many folks maybe on average are in these households and where they're situated, I think would bring some interesting things to sit with. And most of the carbon we breathe, right, comes from a few industries. And I think the impacts of what folks and how we individually consume and impact climate absolutely have an impact on our reality here. But I just kind of want to sit with how we view the commercial kind of lens of centering, how we might identify a particular pocket that is maybe held accountable in this different way through the process. And I think that tie that we were reflecting on from the commercial data we looked at, maybe including multifamily homes. So I'm interested in where those links are with the industry to low income communities. And I guess I'm just sitting with what it means to disaggregate and understand the connection between how, if there is a pivot or focus on consumption-based, I think a framework or emissions that are produced, that there is some space to unpack the extraction of what low-income communities and how they're showing up there. And I see that that's a big system shift, right? How we consume in food, right, is a big thing, and that's, I think, a lot of folks in Portland have smaller. There's not really a bunch of restaurant chains. There are some. So I'm just trying to unpack what that really means and center wealth and unpack and disaggregate how that shows up through the consumption-based lens. So we are being thoughtful about what it means to invest over there, as I perceive. Really it's these industries and the single user piece is going to amplify and lift up the work we're trying to do. But I see that drastic change happening, and that's my own personal, I think, bias from kind of really sitting with what it means to make that transition to a more regenerative economy that centers communities of color. And I think a part of that is doing that work through some of this data. But yeah, I think this was really good for me to understand and unpack some of the goals here in the county and in the city, and information that can really inform some of our next steps.
Thank you, Shanice. Robin?
This actually may be more of a question for Sam. There are a lot of different solutions to some of the challenges here, and I guess I'm questioning about the scope of PCEF. We can have a campaign tell everybody to be vegetarians, and that would help, but I think that's outside the scope of PCEF. Or carbon sequestration, I can't say that word, sequestration. Is that outside the scope? So can you maybe comment on what our scope is a little bit more in terms of what projects we should pursue or not?
I think as we get into the subsequent meetings and as we debrief some of these sectors, what it means, the clean energy bucket, the green infrastructure, sustainable ag bucket of funds, the innovation bucket, I think we'll be able to bring examples to you. Carbon sequestration is called out, in particular in the green infrastructure and sustainable ag sector. So there are certainly projects out there that can be invested in that will be able to really demonstrate carbon sequestration as well as likely community benefit. With regard, if someone was to come to this team with a proposal around advocacy campaign around eating less high carbon foods, I think it's a worthy conversation for this committee, and I'd say let's discuss the merits of it around some structure that will help you all together. But you all telling folks don't eat high carbon may not be the best move.
This is a personal point of view. Maria?
Thank you for bringing this content to us. I think this is good foundational information for us to, receive collectively today. And I'm excited that it's giving us so much food for thought and thinking a lot about what we have in front of us so that we can be proactive about the issues we're seeing today. Like building off of what Robin said, I wonder what the parameters of PCEF are, and I also want to continue to emphasize the interventions and upstream solutions that have to happen at an institutional and systemic and federal, state, county, local level, so that everyone's not just looking at PCEF to pivot from doing the systems change to now handing out band-aids and doing work that's more reactive rather than proactive. So I'm curious to see what levels of interventions that we think can actually result in really powerful outcomes, and what are those? How can we further dive into that so that we're not just chasing some kind of challenge that small funds can address in a really small way, but also thinking about how to continue pushing the system, as well as trying to support those communities who've been adversely impacted by all these externalities, by all these things that they have very little control over, and to keep focusing on that rather than just individual level responsibility. So thank you.
Prentice?
Kyle, thank you for the presentation. I think this has been very helpful in the framework. Definitely has me sort of thinking about how we think about the ways that we can create impact, and how we think about how we frame, how we frame the grant making process as well as the evaluation criteria. And thinking about, not just thinking about how do we fund projects that have the lowest cost with impact, but thinking about it more broadly, thinking about building materials, what's the carbon footprint there, and so sort of thinking about a better value framework as we tackle things that I think you just highlighted, social inequality. So I think it's really important as we think about that, and I think it's a challenge for us as we consider how we frame this and how we take a lead. And I think it's clear that with what little we're working with, I think hopefully this is a great leadership opportunity for city, county, and other regional leaders here to be able to be in alignment on how we tackle this together.
Great. Faith?
Thank you, Kyle, as well. This is great information. So wonderful, the way in which you presented it was a lot of information, but it was really digestible, so thank you for that. And I can see from everyone's faces and also all the comments that have already been made, we'd really love to dig into all of these pieces and particularly the job ahead of us, so I'm really excited about that. While we have you, I wondered if you would point us, if there's anything in particular at the city that's going on or past programs that you've worked on that you would point us to as examples of good practices and policies that we should be lifting up or looking at as we embark on this.
That is a tough question. And part of that is because we need really transformational new actions that really move the needle. And frankly, the things that we've done to date have been important building blocks to get us to where we are, but I'm not sure they're quite on the level of the kind of transformational work that we need to see going forward. This isn't something that's in place, but it's something that I think is important, which is that, as I mentioned, the price signals are all wrong for all of the fossil fuels. And that has to be turned around, but there's a huge equity implication to that. As we're talking about congestion pricing, as we're talking about increasing renewables in the grid, we're going to see rising costs in all of these sectors. And that's actually what's needed in order to address demand in many cases. But there's an equity impact there. And so I really would draw your attention to focus on how we can really support us as a city in trying to figure out how to do that. How do we solve that problem by, in some ways it's about a redistribution of resources. And we really have to think about what that looks like, how to do that equitably, and how to look at pricing, whether it's on transportation or fuels or energy or anything else. But I think that's a big piece. We've seen significant reductions when prices go up for gasoline sales, for example. So when when a gallon of gas doubles in price, we see a 15% reduction in emissions from gasoline. So there is a real strong correlation between price and consumption. And but there's equity implications to that. And so I do think you guys are well positioned to help us think through some of those challenges. I know that doesn't answer your question, but go ahead.
If I could add something, this is Sam here. I would say that it is, one perfect example of that is as we transition, as we know our electric grid is going to transition, we're going to make investments in that ultimately over time will cost more. An individual, an entity that has solar panels is insulated from those costs. And so there's an element of being resilient and being able to make the investments so that folks can be able to shift and we can shore the folks that need to be shored up and enable them to come along in that transition. So there's certainly those investments. I think as you think about this data, and next we will bring you the other side of the data, the community health data, all the range of the other data, the other side of the story. It's going to be important that you think about the carbon impacts as well as the community benefits. And so it'll be the exact challenge of juggling those two and really digging into this data set and parsing all that information out. So you've got certainly a challenge ahead of you on, and then we're eager and excited to engage in that path with you and have those discussions.
Right. Michael, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk, but it is 8 o'clock, so maybe that can, and Megan, did you have one more comment?
I have a question that maybe can be answered. I can ask it, but it can be emailed.
Okay, all right, Michael.
So mine's comment question, but thank you very much. The presentation was wonderful. I think that the neighborhoods, I live in the Gateway neighborhood, and I hope that we all get chances to tour some of the neighborhoods that we're hoping to impact. My neighborhood's really different. I hope you come out, ride a bicycle around, try not to get killed on your bicycle. No, you really should though, because there's definitely, you know, we're food islands, you know, people say things like, no offense, but you know, like, there's not a lot of, you know, chain restaurants until you're out in my neighborhood. There's a lot of chain restaurants, right? Come out, get a Popeye's fried chicken sandwich, because you can get it everywhere. It's, and so I hope that as we do this, that people go and look at the neighborhoods, go and explore the neighborhoods, go and explore the communities that we are going to be working in, because I know that a lot of people live within their own neighborhoods and they don't really leave there, right? Like, I go to the Northwest as little as possible. I don't know a lot about the Northwest. I get lost there really easy. But so I don't know that neighborhood, right? If we want to affect things in the Northwest, I need to go find out about it. I hope that folks come out east, come out past 82nd, come out to Gateway. It's a lot of fun. It's great events. I love it there. And so, yeah, as part of kind of buffering against the future, I think that's why we're looking towards these neighborhoods, because when you're talking about cost of fuels going up, right, that's getting yourself to work, right, because you have to drive farther because it's a place that's affordable, right, and when you have trouble affording housing and gas goes up and you're already pushed out to the outer edges, you know, the cost of fuel can have a huge impact on your life. And especially if you're not working in white collar, if you're working in blue collar jobs. Jeff can probably back me up on this, but my entire career, I haul around 800 pounds worth of tools everywhere I go. I can't ride a bicycle to work. I can't take public transportation. People get really irritated with me. So, you know, there's a lot of those things. Like, my community is a working class community. And a lot of people haul a lot of stuff around with them working. So there's a lot of things that I think have to be taken into account when we're looking at the changes that we mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Megan?
Thank you. I think visiting neighborhoods would be a great thing to do together in like a bus tour or something, that perhaps to see projects. So I like that idea a lot, because I think it would be more informative to do that together than kind of just go explore alone, because we could do it then pack. But my question is, and again, you can email this because I know we're past time. I was just curious, just mention you brought up, which is what's missing in some of the carbon emissions is who are the big actors. So we know like Zenith and like Shell, also like the big actors globally, well, Zenith more locally, but you know, like who are the big actors? And I don't know that PCEF, like the grant funding for community-based organizations, can do a whole lot about that, but I still would like to know what the names are of the top 10 emitters in Portland County. Like, that would be helpful, commercial and individual, I suppose, because it helps to create accountability. I don't know. I don't really know what we can do about that, but it just reminded me when you were talking about who are the big commercial causes. So just aggregating it a little bit.
Actually, send you something by email.
Yeah, I think that we can send that out by email and also include it in the minutes of the meeting when we post those online for this meeting. All right, well, I want to thank.
Can I make one little comment? I'll be really quick.
Sure.
Because I think it's really pertinent to this discussion.
Just echo it, if you might.
Can you identify yourself too?
Oh,
okay. So I work for Cascadia Behavioral Healthcare. We're an affordable housing developer. I also sit on the Portland Policy Metro Council, that is a group association of affordable housing developers. About a month ago, we had a presentation from TriMet as to their plan for disposing of some of their land in very high density areas. And the plan isn't focused on equity and affordable housing. It mentions it, but it doesn't say that that is the most important criteria for how they're going to disperse and dispose of that land. And with this presentation, I think that's something we all should get involved in. They've tabled that decision for now, but we don't know how long it's been tabled.
Great, thank you. And staff will certainly follow up and maybe provide a little bit of additional information for the committee on that issue. Thank you all for coming. Next time it might be longer. We'll get up and stretch in the middle if that's the case. I did want to mention that there's an opportunity December 5th. June has been working hard on putting together a networking event targeting nonprofits who think they will be ready to apply in spring 2020. To kind of give them an opportunity to meet with contractors and consultants who think they might want to work with a nonprofit who's ready to apply. For any kind of grant, it could be a planning grant, a project, or a program. So that's December 5th from 9 a.m. to noon. And I just wanted to note it here in the meeting. We'll make sure that you get an invite. So that's an upcoming opportunity where you can kind of, if you wanted to come and be a fly on the wall and hear what folks are talking about, you're more than welcome to do that. So we'll send that out. And other than that, I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you.
We'll figure out not in terms of, we've gone back and forth about how we, I think we have something we can work on. Just having them together, after you next meeting is actually.
So there's so many challenges to think about that tomorrow. So that's part of the conversation. There's so much. But I do well, my hope would be that we'll have much higher
This is 11. Like 11. Like 10. Is there a big difference? Like 10? Be able to switch the cables?
One on 10, check 1 on 10, 10, 10, 11, 11, 11, 10, 10, 10, 11, 11, 11.
Yeah, we're just trying to keep it involved. Yeah. So.
So you have new people coming in, there's been a chaos. You know, I like that.
Yeah, I don't know every but
the learning curve there. But yeah,
So.
I was working.
So if you were to make the decision by having.
I'd have been back.
You would do it by majority. And so the
Yeah, he had no
majority, like.
But I was not giving you.
We'll practice for that in the Great, yeah. I'm not really talking about that.
He was a little flexible about the protocol. Because AOC was
opening
she was had different instructions. There was the big deal.
That's not a risk.
The state
It's an operating by law. I'm biased. But also the one
yeah, it was great. The consumption-based work was really highlighting
answer to your question, you know, is not about an existing program here, but the network of resources we have to really with so many communities. There's so much pressure
All right, bye. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah.
I won't be at our meeting on Monday because I don't
I will be in Seattle.
Oh, lucky you. Better than Salem.
I've never been to Salem.
But you have been to Seattle.
Yeah. All the left airline flights go to Seattle, so I've been going there my entire life. Yeah. It's like the biggest city in Alaska. That's where we all like the sea high. It's true.
That's funny.
Yeah. No.
So fun. But there's a long history there, right? I mean, that was the jump off point to plastic frontier. Like, didn't everyone go through Seattle back in the day?
I know. I'm most people are there for the military, but it's just that all flights have to be there, and so everybody. Oh, I know. Well, they don't do it when I was a kid, and airplanes were kind of delicious. So before there were airplanes. No, we had airplanes. No, they just had stuff. No, they're like now like every so often we would get like my wife's fiance. I know. I went to prices stop every they were going to Asia. So we got
But you got these amazing options.
Yeah, I mean literally the entire time. Yeah, but all places also stop in Seattle. So everybody is internet shopping and it's like, yeah, and you actually like shop and then everyday flight. Yeah, they do. Now they're like, yeah, they have like wonderful like yeah. Although they're running for 2 years, my family is and for 2 years there was 5 Southern Airlines, had 2 North American stops, and 1 was Fairbanks, Alaska, and it was totally yeah. It was a long
I just wanted to comment on, and the two of you exchanged a look at it. Come
You're, as a bureau, we're trying to figure out how we get
I know, I mean, I've seen that.
I mean, I've been doing it, but that's
yeah, well, and I will say that it has been a shift for me, because I have always thought of together clean alternative.
Yeah.
Because it's the alternative to diesel number 2, as heating oil, I mean, I'm here. And in fact, it really is, like, it's climate constraint, connecting to the grid, all these other balancing resources. I mean, and then do the, just like a matter of. Yeah.
Because it's like ancient engineering and we call it ancient engineers. Yeah, so what they're always
whatever.
But still, I like I know, like,
individually.
no, he was like, you'll be fine. You have to, like, but I think so I told Aaron, like,
She also channeled that.
You'll be a favorite. Oh my God, yes, I owe Matthew Gifford.
Yeah, you both.
Yes, stop talking with Maria. And he was like, I remember.
We just want you to be able to fully say Merck alumni, because I said, what's the Merck alumni? You go, oh, no, it's not actually.
I keep telling people I graduated, so I actually haven't.
So you just want to be able to say that with a clear tongue.
Yeah, I know.
You just owe me one credit. You're
I know. No, it's definitely so fun. Like when you're saying like job working and you have to do job search. Like there's like one day of the week that I might be having that I might have time for.
It is only one credit. I don't know how many credits you have.
I haven't even.
I still have to like. Yeah, and you have to do my that one.
Oh, is it from like the downtown redevelopment class?
Oh, it just pivots. Oh. I just, that's does it go in? Everybody put the music, the mic is in here. Okay, well, now we get to. By the way, I mean, instead of letting one fall off the case. It is a fitting of what this is like. Yeah, they used to just keep a mic stand in each case.
Pardon my,
Yeah, don't just pull. Yeah, that's what I said. I'm like, if I do it, you can do the table thing. Yeah.
Because yeah, it's gambling on the inertia.
Yeah,
Of
and the grippiness of.
Right. So you know what we need? We need a quicker.
I wasn't
Yeah, just put the USB in your computer.
Yeah, because that would just be much.
Yeah, better than having to have somebody being your button for sure.
Well, even if you're afraid, but I just want to point.
Oh, the pointer, yeah.
And it may be more relevant on the side like on Kyle's.
Yeah. Oh, he took off. Yeah.
Peace. Have a great weekend. You got any plans?
Do I have any plans? Stay home. That was that.
You're gone for like a year. I get that. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I didn't. Okay.